The famous Islamic scholar and philosopher from the medieval ages, Ibn Khaldun, is generally regarded as the father of the social sciences. Furthermore, he is widely acclaimed within both Western academia and within the modern Islamic tradition. As such, he is a very important figure to discuss in understanding the development of various disciplines related to history, sociology, and the development of both the Western tradition and the Muslim tradition. To begin with, it's important to note that Ibn Khaldun's ideas tended to be based upon the Islamic tradition. He oftentimes quotes precedent from earlier Muslims as well as incidents from the Quran and the prophetic traditions to demonstrate his points. For example, on the point of degeneracy and how vice and degeneracy within a nation leads to its downfall, he quotes the verse of the Quran, and when we intend to cause a nation to perish, we order its inhabitants to commit evil doings in it. Then the promise becomes true upon them, then we destroy them completely. The ancient Greeks, couldn't have founded this kind of social science because their view was based on mere abstract, logical thought and argumentation. Neither did the Romans or Persians did so. The Islamic tradition traditionally focused on God's customary habits, as Ghazali talks about in his creation, and there are typically patterns which God employs within his creation in terms of preordaining certain fates for them, and certain patterns that repeat over and over again in creation. And the Islamic tradition put a vast emphasis upon law and this kind of legalism, which would have led the likes of Ibn Khaldun to also developing a kind of understanding of the laws of history or the laws of society which guide the developments and the trajectories of various societies. Those who wrote on Ibn Khaldun were many, and initially the Muslims did not pay much attention to Ibn Khaldun's book, unfortunately, the Muqaddimah. This was due to, unfortunately, a general decline in the sort of level of scholarship within the Muslim world and the lack of attention towards the various brilliant thinkers of the tradition. However, eventually the Ottomans gained a hold and became interested in studying this work. Of course, this is understandable as the Ottomans experienced their own civilizational problems, and they may have sought to reverse these civilizational problems by reading Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. The first of those to do so was Mustafa bin Abdullah, famously known as Katib Chalabi, who was born in the year 1609 and passed away in the year 1657. Then came Mustafa Naima, who passed away in the year 1716. And he has an interesting quote regarding the final stage of a civilization in which Ibn Khaldun says a civilization collapses. Mustafa Naima says, indeed, great men are able to effect change in the fifth stage of a cycle, and that they are able to save a civilization from destruction. Then came Muhammad Sahib from 1674 to 1749, who was the Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottomans at the time, and during the era of Ahmed III and Mahmud I. He translated the first 5 chapters of the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah to Turkish. Then came Ahmed Judat Pasha from 1822 to 1895, who completed this translation, and he is considered the last of the famous Turkish historians. He has a very famous quote that indeed from those who most heavily influenced my thought are Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Khaldun. From these historians, the Western academy and Western Orientalists started to gain an understanding of the importance of Ibn Khaldun. The first of these Orientalists to discuss Ibn Khaldun was the German Orientalist von Hammer. Then came Quatremer, who started to translate this work to his work, the Muqaddimah, to French. Then came Baron de Slane, who completed this translation. Eventually, you'd have the likes of the great British historian Arnold Toynbee saying, "Indeed, Ibn Khaldun was inspired and formulated a philosophy for history. It is, without doubt, the greatest work of its kind." Many modern and contemporary Muslim scholars have also sought to understand the importance and develop further on Ibn Khaldun's ideas. For example, the famous Azhari scholar Rashid Rida, in his Majillatul Manar, his famous worldwide Muslim magazine. Ibn Khaldun discusses how to interpret history. An important question that arises here is that, is this kind of interpretation proposed by Ibn Khaldun a historical materialist interpretation like Marx's hold, or is it simply an observation on a civilizational scale about the effects of the market, trade, and economy upon a civilization? It's very important to note that unfortunately people tend to back project or superimpose their own secularist or post-enlightenment sort of tendencies and values and agendas onto early Muslims, even though this doesn't make sense and this doesn't really mean anything, because these figures and these generations existed pre-modernity, so these ideas existing in their time make no sense. For example, some have argued that Abu Dhar, the prophetic companion, was a socialist due to his specific view regarding Kanzul Mal, the treasury. Right? He argued against the hoarding of wealth, and he criticized very severely many of the very rich companions of the Prophet Muhammad, such as Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, for their excessive wealth. Or, for example, some have argued for the Khawarij rebels, the Kharijites, being rebels against democracy or majority vote. But the reality is that these tend to be radical reinterpretations of past historical facts based on secular back projecting and superimposing of your own narrative onto the past. Ibn Khaldun furthermore talks about many of the hadiths of medicine, and Ibn Khaldun didn't distinguish between the authentic prophetic traditions and the weak prophetic traditions in this regard. Rather, he generalized and gave judgment upon all of them, that they were generally weak or not to be trusted. And he said that this enters under the hadith, that the prophetic tradition, that you are more knowledgeable about the affairs of your world. But it's interesting to note that Ibn Khaldun himself at the same time also argues that the Sharia, that the divinely revealed sort of law of Islam, is necessary, and it's the best kind of law, and it's necessary for man's salvation in this world and the next. And so it's interesting to see how Ibn Khaldun was interpreted by later figures and later authorities. Of course, those who have a more religious inclination have used Ibn Khaldun in a more Islamic manner, and those with a more secular inclination have used him in a more secular manner. And an interesting case is the Arab nationalists, who, although in many cases being very religious and very Muslim, ultimately have a very secular view of Ibn Khaldun. It's interesting to see thus the various interpretations of Ibn Khaldun. The reality is that many of the more secular interpretations can be seen as secular back projecting, and the reality is that Ibn Khaldun, even if he digressed from certain points of orthodoxy from time to time, such as his point of view regarding medicine, had prophetic traditions about medicine, overall he was still very much committed to the Islamic project, as is understandable and to be expected from any Islamic scholar and thinker pre-modernity, to be completely honest here. That doesn't mean he's necessarily correct in everything, and we don't have to agree with him in everything he's saying. Indeed, it'd be absurd to ask somebody to agree with everything that a past scholar is saying. But the point here is that we should try and genuinely understand his ideas and not just back project onto him. Ibn Khaldun thus makes a distinction between three types of governance. He talks about naturalistic or animalistic sort of governance, which is based upon oppression and power, and it results in a lot of degeneracy. Then there's this kind of rational political governance, which is based on rational or political laws. It is better than the first, and it is found within reality. However, the third is the revealed divine law, and man's salvation is found in this. And Ibn Khaldun argues that one or civilization should rely upon this kind of law in order for that society to flourish in what he would term as this life and in the next, meaning for a religious person to be prosperous in this life and in the life of the hereafter.